on the morning of December 7th, 1941. The Antares was pulling a barge behind it. The signalman saw something very strange.
It's following in the wake, and it looks awful like the shape of a submarine conning tower, only smaller.
The Antares sent a message that this was some kind of an enemy incursion.
The USS Ward fired upon the mini-sub when they saw it.
Gun number 1 barks, gun number 3 barks, and a shell hits it right between the sail and the hull, and the submarine dives.
The crew of the USS Ward didn't know it yet, but they have just fired the first American shots of the Second World War.
What the Americans also don't know yet is what's going to follow behind. A surprise attack from a hidden enemy that will cost nearly 2,400 lives and change history.
It's one of those crucial days in history, like the attack on the Twin Towers on September the 11th. You know the world won't be the same after as it had been before.
Now, using rare archive and eyewitness accounts, this is the attack on Pearl Harbor as it unfolded, minute by minute. An enormous naval armada is gathering 125 miles northeast of Japan's main islands, in a remote location at Hitakapu Bay. The mission is so secret that only a handful of the thousands of Japanese men assembling here know their destination.
On board the Japanese ships, there's just wild speculation as to where they might be headed. This could be another training exercise.
Many of the men thought maybe it's an attack on the Americans in the Aleutians because we're heading north, but they really had no idea where they were going.
On board one of the 6 aircraft carriers is 23-year-old torpedo bomber Masumitsu Yoshioka. Now 103, he is one of the last remaining Japanese survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack.
どこに向かって走って、何のために走っていくかということでちゃんと教えてもらって知ってるのに、その時に限ってどこに向かって走ってるのか。
The fleet that's assembling aims to carry out one of the most complex and ambitious operations in the history of naval warfare. They plan to sail a fleet of aircraft carriers 3,500 miles across an ocean and attack the home of the US Pacific Fleet on the Hawaiian island of Oahu.
Not only were they planning to attack the naval harbor and to destroy the US Pacific Fleet, they were also going to attack all the airfields on Oahu Island as well. It was very ambitious, but also very daring.
艦長が軍事夢にありました。暴虐不遜なる米国に対し12月8日を期して戦争するっていうことをまず私の体の血液が頭から全部デッキに吸い込まれたような感じになりました。これはいよいよ行かなくちゃならない大戦争になる帰ってこれないなと思ってすぐそういうことを思いました。
The attack on Pearl Harbor is to be the decisive blow in Japan's strategy of imperial expansion. They have already invaded large parts of northeastern China and need oil to continue their expansion.
Japan is an island nation, and many of their main product and resources, especially oil, had to be imported. And the United States was one of the main people to provide that.
In August 1941, America cuts off Japan's oil supply after it invades French Indochina.
Diplomatic negotiations between Washington and Tokyo, in theory, still carries on. The military junta that was leading Japan concluded that they were not going to gain access to the reserves it needed by negotiations. The only way was by violence.
To get oil, Japan plans to invade the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. But there's a snag.
They knew the United States would be the power that would get in their way, especially because the United States occupied the Philippines.
So it was already set. They were going to take the Philippines, and in order to be able to take the Philippines, they had to first wipe the American Pacific Fleet off the map.
Sunrise in Pearl Harbor, the home of America's Pacific Fleet. More than 90 ships are based here in its natural harbor, as well as 84,000 servicemen on the island of Oahu.
Pearl Harbor was a great posting. If you were an American serviceman, there was no better place to be posted right before the war. Lovely climate, nice people. There's bars and restaurants and the beach and, you know, lots to do if you're a serviceman.
In charge of this paradise posting is Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, who took over as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in February 1941.
Admiral Husband Kimmel was an efficient, very well-organized admiral. He's the type of person to be more admired than liked, perhaps, but he was also incredibly well-respected because he became the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet above many other senior admirals.
Kimmel was really dedicated to training and to exercises, activities that were going to be needed to prepare the United States for war that everybody knew was coming.
We've been out there for 20 months training. We were highly trained for anything that happened. Everything was training for war, live ammunition and everything else. So it was all instilled in you.
But it wasn't the readiness of his men that would be tested first. It was Kimmel's own instincts as a commander. On November the 27th, he receives intelligence warning of an attack somewhere in the Pacific.
The war warning said Japanese intentions are not known, their actions are going to be unpredictable, just be prepared.
In Hitakapu Bay, the Japanese strike force, or Kido Butai, is now at full strength and sets off on its 3,500-mile journey to Hawaii. Alongside the 6 massive carriers, with 387 aircraft on board, are 2 battleships, 9 destroyers, plus numerous cruisers, submarines, and support ships.
Most navies use their aircraft carriers to go find the enemy out there at sea and report back to where it was so that the big ships with the guns could find them and engage them. Using aircraft carriers in a massed force was an unusual naval tactic. It was quite revolutionary.
It was quite demanding of the Japanese Navy as well, because they only had 10 aircraft carriers. But the fact that they don't have to wait for war to come and wait for it on the Japanese soil was quite revolutionary too.
For the mission to succeed, the strike force must remain undetected over its 12-day journey.
The strike force, when it left, really entered its own isolated world. It didn't send out reconnaissance planes, and they were very careful about dumping garbage over the sides of their ship in case an American submarine happened to be sailing by.
All of the Japanese ships are keeping position on each other strictly through visual means. They're using flags and semaphores to maintain position and to communicate. There's no radio traffic whatsoever.
The Japanese also go to extraordinary lengths to fool American intelligence about the whereabouts of the fleet.
Each radio operator has a very distinctive hand. It was more like a fingerprint. So these men in groups stayed in Japan and sent out messages one right after the other using the carriers and other ships' call signs as a deception measure.
The Japanese plan to attack Pearl Harbor has taken more than 9 months to devise. Its architect is Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto.
Isoroku Yamamoto was a conflicting, if not paradoxical character. There was this side of him who was a very rational thinker. The other side of him was a very big gambler.
In January 1941, Admiral Yamamoto begins floating his attack plan, but many oppose him.
There were many people in the naval hierarchy who thought this was a suicide mission and that it was unnecessary. Particularly, they did not want to give him so many aircraft carriers.
With so much opposition, the plan stalls until Yamamoto plays his trump card.
Yamamoto threatened to resign, and so did his followers.
He was so well known and respected that threatening to resign would carry a lot of weight. And so he did prevail.
His plan was passed in October 1941, but many still had misgivings.
アメリカと戦争するんでは向こうのは戦闘機もたくさん持ってますし軍艦もたくさん持ってますからもう帰ってくれないなと帰ってくることはできないなともう覚悟しましたですよね。
In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel and his team are pondering the extraordinary news that they've just received about the possibility of a Japanese attack.
Washington sent all of its commanders in the Pacific a message that was unprecedented in American naval history. That message simply said in its first line, this dispatch is to be considered a war warning. And it also said, we think the attack from the Japanese will occur in the Philippines or in Borneo. It didn't say Hawaii, but it did tell Kimmel, you should prepare.
The American bases around the Pacific are receiving lots of different pieces of intelligence, which point to the imminence of a Japanese attack. Kimmel is alerted, but the whole military is not on a wartime footing. War hasn't been declared. They don't know where it's coming from. They don't know how it's going to be made.
Meanwhile, over 1,600 miles out to sea, the Japanese fleet is nearly halfway to Pearl Harbor.
The route that the Japanese have selected to approach Hawaii is through the most desolate stretches of the northern Pacific, which means that the weather is absolutely wretched.
There were men who were washed off the deck. It was also very cold and very uncomfortable. The Japanese wasted little fuel in trying to keep the interior of the ships warm, and they were using cold seawater to bathe in. So it was a brutally cold crossing in winter.
ストックアップを執行してからですね、ずっと天候が悪くてですね、碁とか将棋とか、あれは何ていうんですか、レコード聞くとか遊んで暮らしていました。特にみんな死ぬとか生きるとかってことを一人も話していませんので。
On board the aircraft carrier Akagi is the commander of the Japanese fleet, Vice Admiral Chi-Chi Nagumo.
The Strike Fleet commander was a very easily worried character, and he was always on edge about would they hear a message from Tokyo telling them that the attack was off.
But today, Nagumo receives the order he's been waiting for.
The order says, climb Mount Niitaka. That means to him that negotiations with the Americans have conclusively broken down, that there is no hope of avoiding war.
If there had been some breakthrough in Washington, then the fleet on its route would have been radioed and told, peace has broken out. But these negotiations were going nowhere, and both sides knew it.
And at this point, Nagumo's force was to carry out its mission and destroy as much of the American Navy in Pearl Harbor as he possibly can.
Pearl Harbor is a remarkable geologic feature cut into the south coast of the island of Oahu. And its principal or unusual trait was how shallow it was. The depth of the water was about 45 feet. And that shallowness became an asset in terms of being threatened by airdropped torpedoes.
Traditionally, torpedoes dropped from a height would sink probably 40, 50, 60 feet into the sea before beginning their trajectory. So a harbor is not a good place to attack ships in conventional thinking.
The Japanese solution to this problem was to put wooden fins onto their airdropped torpedoes that would act as sort of a shock absorber. So when the torpedo hits the surface of the water, these wooden fins absorb the shock, shatter, blow off, and thereby shallow up the dive of the torpedo.
They also severely limited the speed of the aircraft, and they asked the pilots to cant the nose of the aircraft up about 5 degrees to ensure that the torpedo would fall flat into the water. That was what kept the torpedo from diving too deeply and lodging into the mud of the harbor.
The flying crews are specially selected to carry out the difficult maneuvers.
They were all crack pilots, and that was necessarily so because the Japanese Naval Air Force was very small and the resources were limited, especially after the embargo. So they had to choose a select few who could really fly. The pilots started training in the south of Japan, in Kinko Bay, which was shaped just like Pearl Harbor. The pilots didn't know for what they were training.
距離とか高さがっていうことを経験が聞きませんのでですね、目で覚えるように訓練をやって浅い海面を来撃する訓練だっていうことは分かっていました。聞いていました。で
Their prime targets are the US Pacific Fleet's 8 battleships. Moored in the center of the harbor, on the pier, Battleship Row.
From the Japanese perspective, battleships are still the coin of the realm. That's how you measure naval power in 1941. And so if they can sink 4 or 5 American battleships, that will put the battle line out of commission and that will constitute success for the operation.
Their secondary targets are the fleet's 3 enormous aircraft carriers, which are usually moored on the northern flank of Ford Island, on Carrier Row.
Though air power was clearly rising in importance, all navies of the world were still centered on battleships as their single most important naval weapon. Yamamoto hoped that by destroying the American Pacific Fleet's battleships, it would be as much a psychological blow as it would be an actual military blow.
At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel meets his intelligence chief, Edwin Layton. The news he hears could be crucial in helping prepare for an attack.
His intelligence chief said, "I have to tell you, Admiral, that 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers aren't saying anything. There's no radio traffic from them. They aren't communicating or receiving messages."
Japanese ships had gone missing before, so Kimmel and Layton are not unduly concerned.
He said, "Now, Admiral, I think that means they are in port and therefore not talking." And Kimmel did agree with his intelligence chief that the silence of those carriers meant that they were in home water.
But it's a crucial misjudgment.
Those 4 carriers were 4 of the 6 that were on their way to Hawaii.
Unbeknown to the Americans, the Japanese fleet is also receiving vital intelligence. Their source in Hawaii is a spy called Takeo Yoshikawa. He's been hiding in plain sight amongst Hawaii's large Japanese population for the past 8 months.
He's one of the greatest spies of World War II. And his job was to study the operations of the Pacific Fleet, its moorings, its capabilities, to fly over its airfields, see what the strength of aircraft was.
He is a trained naval officer, and so he knows what to look for. And he's also a very creative guy. I mean, he's willing to go to some interesting lengths to gather this sort of intel.
Yoshikawa found a taxi driver who would drive him all over the island to see different points. He went on boat rides. He would dive sometimes in the waters, and he would use a thin reed to be able to breathe underwater. He has noted that there are no anti-torpedo nets around the battleships. Yoshikawa also observes that there are no barrage balloons.
Barrage balloons would make aerial attack more difficult. Yoshikawa does a pretty effective job of laying out the basic rhythm of how the Pacific Fleet is operating in this time. They're usually in port on the weekends, and that is the critical piece of information that leads to Yamamoto's decision to attack on a Sunday morning.
In Washington, President Roosevelt is alerted to a decoded internal Japanese diplomatic message, signaling their intention to pull out of peace talks.
There were instructions in that message for Japanese embassies to begin burning documents, destroying their code books, destroying their code machines. That too suggests a sort of finality to the negotiation process that has been ongoing all this fall.
Roosevelt is very seriously alarmed when he reads this message, and he turns to his naval aide who gives it to him and says, "What do you think this means?" And he says, "Well, if there was 1 in 1,000 chance of keeping the peace yesterday, today it's only 1 in 1,000,000.
Saturday night before Pearl Harbor is a typical night out on the town for a lot of these servicemen. They're out drinking, they're eating, they're spending time with their friends. And there's a battle of the bands that is also occurring.
It was a competition among all the battleships there. And I think we had gone through about half of them. And our band was still in first place. We would play a lot of march music or light classical music and maybe a little Latin music here or there. We were the favorite band there. The last number we played, I think, was named White Heat. It was fast and loud. The winner was judged by applause, so I think we had more crew there all the time. So we were still in first place.
The Japanese strike force is now 400 miles from Hawaii and nearing its final attack position. On the bridge of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo receives a final message from the spy in Pearl Harbor.
On the eve of this attack, it doesn't look like there are going to be any American aircraft carriers in the harbor. That's a real disappointment. But at the same time, there's also an understanding that there are plenty of battleship targets and other worthy targets there.
出発する前の夜は特にやっぱ落ち着いていましてですね、死ぬということに関してはですね、飛行機に乗って出たらもう覚悟して出してならないと普段から思っていますので、特にですね、ハワイ行くので死ぬってことを怖いと思わなかったです。
Then, just outside Pearl Harbor, US sailors spot an unusual submarine-like vessel in the defensive area. They report it, but it then disappears.
Pearl Harbor is an experiment of new military devices that has been not used in the Second World War until that time. One of the weapons developed was a midget submarine. They would be carried by mother submarines and launched.
It was always that thought that the wooden fin modifications on the aerial torpedoes would not work. So the Japanese had a backup plan in the form of these 5 miniature submarines.
They're about 80 feet long, 6 feet wide at the widest part, and they're very, very cramped. There's only 2 people inside of the sub, very, very hot conditions. It's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit inside of the sub, and basically, the whole purpose of them is to sneak into Pearl Harbor to have extra torpedo power.
Back in Washington, the final part of the message from the Japanese government, outlining their plans to end peace talks, is intercepted by naval intelligence and reveals Japan's plans.
It had wording to the effect that in light of the views of the Japanese government, all negotiations should be terminated. And it almost read like a declaration of war.
But this was all part of the Japanese plan.
The reason the Japanese did this was because they wanted in later days to be able to tell people that we did warn the Americans.
Significantly, the message instructs the Japanese ambassador to deliver it at 1 p.m. Washington time, which is 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii.
That caused enough concern that maybe something was going to happen at 1 o'clock that Washington began to prepare messages for Hawaii and elsewhere to alert them to the significance of that.
Such vital warning messages would normally be sent straight through military channels. But there's a problem.
The problem was that the radio circuits between Washington and Honolulu were not good that morning. So they had to resort to sending them by commercial means.
The crucial message is sent via Western Union instead. It won't arrive in Hawaii until 7:33 a.m., just 15 minutes before the Japanese attack actually begins. Meanwhile, on board the carrier Soiru, pilots and crews get ready for the attack.
間違って撃たれて落下傘で降りたら大変だが捕虜になるから落下傘のバンドをつけるのやめようってことでハワイに行く時は落下傘バンドをつけないで来ました全員。
At 6 a.m., the strike force arrives at its attack position 180 miles northeast of Hawaii, and the first wave of planes take off from the Japanese carriers.
暗くてよく見えない時にから発艦しだしたんですけども、戦闘機が9機先に発艦してきまして、浮力がつけなくてそのまま海にして一気落っこちましたが。
Their plan is to fly in two waves, one after the other, with the torpedo bombers starting the attack on the harbor and the airfields being hit straight after.
The first wave has 40 torpedo bombers, which would try to sink the American battleships. And then there were 50 horizontal high-level bombers to attack the inboard battleships.
They are supported by dive bombers and fighters, and are led by Commander Mitsu Fushida. Back at Pearl Harbor, the Americans once again spot a submarine-like vessel.
The USS Ward spots it, and they fire at it. Their first shot misses, but then their second shot hits. And they're pretty certain that they have sunk whatever this is. The crew of the USS Ward didn't know it yet, but they have just fired the first American shots of the Second World War.
A message is sent into Pearl Harbor. We have fired and depth charged a submarine operating within the defensive sea area.
That message, unfortunately, began to only creep up the chain of command.
There have been so many instances of reports of subs that turn out to be false that the report really doesn't go anywhere.
Meanwhile, at Apana Point on the northern tip of Oahu, radar operators spot what appears to be a large number of planes approaching rapidly.
Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott of the Aircraft Warning Service noticed a large target which appeared on their oscilloscopes. It was larger than any other sighting they had seen before. And they watched it for a few minutes and they said, "We really do need to report this."
"13 minutes after the sighting, they call a switchboard operator who relays the message to the officer in charge, First Lieutenant Kermit Tyler.
Kermit Tyler remembered what a friend had told him, that when flights of American B-17s came in from the West Coast, KGMB broadcast Hawaiian music all night long as a navigation aid. And when Kermit heard this, he recalled that he had been listening to Hawaiian music during the drive, and he concluded, well, this is probably these B-17s.
He knew nothing about radar, was only there because he had been told to be there all night so that he could see how radar identification worked. And he told the two guys at Opana Point, don't worry about it.
The delayed message from Washington, warning military bases to be on high alert, finally arrives at the RCA telegraph office in Honolulu.
A messenger shows up and puts it into his parcel, hops on his motorcycle. But given the traffic in Honolulu at that time, it takes him an inordinately long time to actually get through the traffic and out to Pearl Harbor. And so the message does not arrive until it's too late.
At the same time, Admiral Kimmel is getting ready to play golf when news of the mini-sub skirmish arrives.
When Kimmel gets word that a submarine has been attacked at the entrance of the harbor, it's obviously of great concern. He cancels the golf game with General Short, is in the process of getting himself ready to go back to his headquarters so that he can start getting a better handle on the situation.
Just off the coast of Oahu, the first wave of Japanese planes approaches the island.
The residents of Hawaii said, "Oh my heavens, this is just another one of these stupid drills." And for the longest time, they did not pay any attention to it.
Japanese planes fill the skies above Oahu and await a crucial signal from their leader, Mitsu Fushida, to attack.
If one flare went out, surprise had been achieved. If two flares are shot out, surprise had not been achieved. So that would alter the way the attack would take place.
They get there, they find nobody's expecting them, so the attack is a surprise. Mitsu Fushida fires his flare, but he doesn't think one of his flight leaders has noticed this because he doesn't get in the correct pattern. So he decides he's gonna fire a second flare just to make sure everybody has seen it. But another one of his flight leaders, when he sees that second flare, he thinks it has been a double flare and he is supposed to attack immediately. So he ends up pulling out of formation, leading his planes in to attack.
The misunderstanding means that bombers and fighter planes will now attack the airfields first, while the torpedo bombers wait for them to take out the American defenses.
What should happen is the torpedo planes attack first, because they are going to have to attack low and slow. They're going to be very vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. So you want that part of the attack to occur as soon as possible before the Americans are alerted so that it has a better chance of success.
Wheeler Airfield in central Oahu is the first to be hit, followed by Kanahoe Air Station in the east of the island.
We were heading over to get breakfast, and as we walked out the barracks door, a Japanese plane flew by. And since the Army had been having maneuvers, I said, "Oh, look, the Army's making this really look real. They've painted the plane like a Japanese plane, and they're pretending that they're attacking us."
I was assigned to the aircraft on the water for that day. We had planned the training, and I was getting ready to do that. I heard aircraft flying and looked out, and I saw a formation of planes coming. I don't know if I was hit on the first run or the second, but I could see where the bullets were hitting and little squirts of water coming up through the bottom. And then the bullets obviously penetrated the gas tanks, and the plane just went up in flame very, very rapidly.
They strafed our hangar. We ran toward the hangar, and when we got down there, sure enough, they had strafed almost all of our planes.
Planes at airfields across Oahu had been positioned so they could be easily guarded.
The military had grouped them together rather than separating them, because they feared sabotage by the Japanese-American residents far more than they feared attack by airplanes. So the military handed the Japanese on a platter airplanes they could easily destroy.
We tried to move some of them. We got to pulling them apart because some of them were burning so they wouldn't catch each other on fire.
The results are tremendous damage to the Americans, burning hangars, destroyed aircraft, lots and lots of smoke, certainly casualties.
I got burned getting out, had to swim through the gasoline burning on the water. We had 3 or 4 planes on the water, and I think that I'm the only one that got out alive.
At this point, with the Japanese level bombers and torpedo bombers and dive bombers all approaching Pearl Harbor directly, and there's not a plane in the sky from the American side.
Japanese commander Mitsuo Fuchida, flying over Pearl Harbor, sends the coded message using the repeated Japanese word for tiger, Tora, 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 meaning we have achieved complete surprise.
He tells his radio operator to tap out the message. It's at that point then that he starts to begin their assault on the harbor. It's pretty clear that there is no hope for the Americans to avoid what is coming, which is going to be an absolutely devastating attack.
Next time, the Japanese unleash the full force of their weapons on the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor.
The bomb went right down through the center of the ship, and I was knocked off the deck.
We lost 1,177 men in 10 minutes. We're just lucky that we were alive.
He was yelling at me to get in one of those boats. I said, I'm not leaving. My brother's there someplace. I gotta find him. I gotta find him.
The gates of hell had been opened up. The scene is absolutely cataclysmic.